Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to our final Tuesday talk of the season. It's been a fabulous year, and we're very excited to have Sarah here to talk to us and help us further contextualize the art of Lee Krasner that's all around you. So I'd like to begin with some thanks. I'd like to thank all of you for being here tonight. To our members and supporters, you make all that we do possible. I'd also like to thank our board of trustees, particularly our board chair, Carol Leary, who's right here, as well as Richard Benefield, the chair of the collections committee, for all of his support. The curators of this exhibition, one of whom is right here, Devin Zimmerman and Michelle Weegee of Yale University Art Gallery, I think deserve quite a round of applause. Thank you to Devin and Michelle. I'd also like to thank our season sponsors, Fotine and Tom Cote, as well as Anne Ramsey Jenkins, who is also here on the floor. Round of applause. Thank you, Anne. And this particular exhibition has been supported by the Art Advisory Council, which consists of Tom Keyes and Keith Fox, Leslie and Michael Weissman, Matthew Gallant, Alex Abedin, and Catherine Litwin. Further, I'd like to thank the Women's Art Alliance, who all these individuals came together and helped create a fund to support this exhibition. And a number of them are here today. So I'm actually going to take this time to read their names out. Carol Aaron, Ashley Benecki, Allison Cavaretta, Annie Forsyth, Carol Leary, Tammy Mallon, Jennifer Moores, Gail Morgan, Barbara O'Leary, Anne Ramsey Jenkins, Nan Ramsey, Pamela Sawyer, Mary Ann Takiff, Rob Walker, and Nancy J. White. A round of applause for all of these women who came together. I think as many of you know that this exhibition has been very well received of late, not only TV, but radio, as well as print, just to name a few. The article in Main Home and Design that just came out, as well as the Wall Street Journal, have really helped, I think, the world come to understand what's happening here at the Ogunquit Museum. And to that, we could add this collaboration with the Levitt Theater that we just had, where we showed the film Pollock, which is a 2000 film directed by Ed Harris, starring Marcia Gay Harden. And that was very, very well received by the community. And we like to joke that we don't know who Jackson Pollock is here at OMAA, but we know a lot about Lee Krasner and her contemporaries. So I have one very exciting fact to share with you, and that is our earned media report was just delivered to my inbox, and this is something that we've been tracking now very carefully for a number of years. And we have reached 619 million people so far this year with our media reach. That is huge. That's well more than double what we were able to do in previous years combined. So 619 million people. I think that deserves a round of applause. Thank you. So with that, I'd like to welcome Devin Zimmerman, who is our curator of modern and contemporary art, and he's going to introduce our speaker this evening.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. It's really my pleasure today to introduce you all to Sarah Humphreville, who is the Lunder Curator of American Art at the Colby Museum of Art in Waterville, Maine. Since joining the museum, Sarah has worked on numerous exhibition projects. The amount is just kind of staggering, but that includes Come Closer selections from the collection 1978 to 1994, as well as Eastman Johnson in Maine and Some American Stories, the reinstallation and interpretation of the Lunder wing that leads visitors on a journey from before the founding of the United States to the present day. Both are currently on view. I highly recommend you make the trek up to Waterville because both are excellent and gorgeous representations of both projects. They're beautifully installed, beautifully curated. They're treats. Prior to her position in Maine, Sarah worked at the Whitney Museum of American Art as a senior curatorial assistant. During her tenure at the Whitney, Sarah worked on 12 special and permanent collection exhibitions and curated the revelatory Labyrinths of Form, Women in Abstraction, 1930 to 1950. One of the reasons she is here and going to dive deep into the subject matter tonight, as well as being recognized for curatorial contributions to several projects, including Vida Americana, Mexican Muralists Remake American Art, 1925 to 1945, Grant Wood, American Gothic and Other Fables, and Stuart Davis in Full Swing. So it is my pleasure again to introduce you all to Sarah Humphreville. Please give her a round of applause.
All right. Hi, everyone. As Devin said, I'm Sarah Humphreville. I'm the Lunder Curator of American Art at the Colby College Museum. If you feel like coming north on Thursday, where you're having an opening reception for Some American Stories, the Lunder Wing, everyone's invited. I'd love to see you there. And I also just want to take a moment to thank the museum and Devin in particular for inviting me down to talk with you all tonight, and to thank you all for being here. So this evening, in conjunction with this beautiful show, Lee Krasner, Geometries of Expression, in mind, I'll be speaking with you about the artistic and social context of Lee Krasner's early career. So as the current exhibition shows, Krasner was really just one of a number of American artists in the 1930s and 1940s to turn to abstraction. And, that kind of begs the question, like, why are they turning to abstraction? And for them, they really understood it as a new form to express the new age, right? This is something that seems inherently modern in a world that is changing rapidly with technology and urbanization, for example. And as abstraction blossomed, women artists, including Krasner, were at the forefront of its formal, technical, and conceptual evolution. So before we jump in further, I just want to set the stage for a minute for you with, double. Okay. Setting the stage. Paintings probably that look quite familiar to you with Grant Wood's American Gothic and Edward Hopper's Early Sunday Morning. So I show these because, abstract art is, I think, something that we really take for granted now. But, 90 or so years ago, to be an abstract artist, particularly as a woman in the United States, was a really, really radical endeavor. In general, European art was favored by the art establishment, and with regard to American art, when it was shown or was acknowledged, realism was really what prevailed. This painting by Grant Wood from 1930, Early Sunday Morning from the same year, this is, Grant Wood's moment of coming out. It propels him to fame overnight, and this is something that therefore is showing us that the popular, not just the popular art audience, but really the, kind of popular culture in general is really having an appetite for this type of visual language. And so, galleries, museums basically ignore American abstraction. And in the few cases that it is shown, the critics then heap on and really go off against it in the papers and in magazines. I think, notably here too, that the two works that I've picked as, really icons of American art at this moment are both by men, which we're going to dive away from them now. So in addition to abstraction being a sort of aberration during this period, women in general are in a profession that is dominated by men and had to contend with, not only that, but just general sexism and societal expectations on a regular basis. And so by being female, by being American, and by working in abstraction, women who are working in this mode are really facing compound layers of marginalization. Arts professionals are scoffing at their endeavors. That leads some women to actually try to disguise their gender identity and how they're identifying professionally. So if you look at this image on the left, and I hope even everyone in the back can see it, you can see that the signature says I Race Pereira rather than the artist's first full name of Irene. That's, something very intentional, so that she's avoiding, if this is out in the world, somebody immediately being able to dismiss it, saying, oh, this is by a woman artist. Notably, to this exhibition in particular, that was something that Krasner also did. She sometimes didn't sign her work. She sometimes signed it as LK. And also, Lee was not her given name at birth. She commonly went by Lenore outside of her family, and as she went into the art world, made that adjustment to her persona. On top of this, women artists, they have lives outside of art. They are sometimes married, they sometimes have children, and they are facing these gender dynamics at home too. So especially ones even that are married to other artists or playing second fiddle to their careers. I think Pollock and Krasner is probably the most famous example of that, but that was true for a number of other artists in their circles as well. And I think one really telling example here, we see the artist Alice Trumbull Mason, whose work is on that wall over there. You see a study and a related painting done just a few years after this quote that I'm going to read you now. So she actually halted her artistic practice from 1930 to 1935. She's one of the first artists in the US in general making non-objective paintings. So, not even just abstractions that are based on looking at a still life and figuring out a new way of looking at them, but really rooted in compositional design. And she has this breakthrough, and then she stops the following year to take care of her children. And kind of at the end of this time in 1934, she writes to her sister, "Maybe you think intellectual life is not the thing, but damn it, just caring for babies isn't either. I am chafing to get back to painting, and of course it's at least a couple years away. The babies are adorable and terribly interesting. I'm not saying anything against them, but I don't want to. I can't be absorbed in just them, even though they won't be babies for very long." So within this context, now that we've set up all the obstacles, how is it that abstraction came to flourish in the United States, and why were so many women drawn to it? So on the point about women's interest in this, abstraction really provides aesthetic freedom. There are no expectations around what is appropriate subject matter, what an abstract painting is supposed to look like it, and who should be making it. So if we think about, kind of the longer history of Western painting, you might, have a male artist who is expected to make history paintings glorifying war or mythological subjects or what have you that are done at a grand scale. Whereas it's appropriate for a woman to make a still life painting. So that's what I'm, kind of getting at here. And the women artists did recognize this. So Pearl Fine, who's also on view here, described abstraction as being free from the, quote, oppressive particularities of realism. So this idea that this is a new art for a new age means that it also really gets to be invented as to how is making it and who is making it. In addition to this, there's also a few major shifts in the cultural landscape in the United States and in New York in particular that really help facilitate this. So that includes the opening of new venues to view modern art in the United States. So the Société Anonyme is founded in 1920 and staged a major show of avant-garde art at the Brooklyn Museum in 1926, which is what we see here in the image on the right. And then Albert E. Gallatin opened the Gallery of Living Art at NYU in 1925. And most famously, the Museum of Modern Art opened in 1929. So the Société Anonyme was notably co-founded and led by a woman, Catherine Dreyer. And she saw the, quote, urgent need in the art world for people to acquaint themselves with the latest movements in modern painting and sculpture. And she worked with other artists, notably Duchamp, who's famously affiliated with this, to set this up. But it really became her project. And I think, importantly, she was also an artist. If people recognize her name, it's really for this work as a patron, as a curator, for the huge gift of art that she manned to the Yale University Art Gallery. And I think her own art has actually been overlooked within this, but it was critical to her understanding what everybody else was doing too. And so she began working abstractly in 1918 and really spent the next 11 years, and developing mature style, had kind of arrived at it by 1929. And in this work, in 1934, we really see Dreyer in her prime. And this is a print from a portfolio called 40 Variations, which really takes a kind of unique approach to how we can think about a print and how it's made. So each print in the 40 works in the series has the same base. So when you're looking at what the black lines are in this lithograph, that's the same in all of them. But then the way that it's colored from sheet to sheet is different. So that's the variation in the 40 variations. And in this work, she's inspired by music and she's inspired by sailing. And we really, kind of see this whimsy of approach as she's actually taking a kind of whimsical approach to lithography, really opening up some of the rigors of printmaking. She also, with this work, really expanded the idea of taking a lithograph beyond paper. And she was, not only connected to a number of visual artists, but also performing artists. And her friend, Ted Shawn, choreographed a dance with an accompanying score that another friend, Jess Meeker, wrote. And it was performed in 1936 by the group of men dancers, which Shawn was affiliated with. And then again in 1939, which we say here, by the Carolyn Ballet at the Baltimore Museum of Art. So we see, this design that we just saw from the print in the background, but also how these shapes then enter into the costumes here. Going back to then the other circumstances for how abstraction is flourishing at this moment in time. At the same time that these new venues for avant-garde art are opening, modernist-inclined teachers are also beginning to work in various art institutions around the country. Within New York, Arshel Gorky is teaching at the Grand Central School of Art from 1926 to 1931. He's also spending time humming around the Art Students League and interacting with students there. And that school also sees Václav Vitlichil, Jan Matulka, and Hans Hofmann work there. They all start working there between 1928 and 1932. So, same moment in time. And then Hofmann famously opens his own school in New York and then Provincetown in 1934 and 1935. And so we see them interacting with their students in these photographs. Krasner was one of the artists who was affected by these revolutions in the New York Museum and educational institutions. She had taken courses at a number of different art schools around the city, and that training was really, quite academic, quite traditional. She also, though, began to go to the Museum of Modern Art, and she even got scolded for kind of bringing some of what she was teaching herself in the galleries into her more academic environments. But she described going to MoMA as experiencing it like a bomb that exploded. And then that tells you really like what a major effect museums can have, right? Like this is the power of art and this is how it is affecting artists. And then in 1937, she decides to enroll in classes with Hofmann at his school. And that really proves to be a major catalyst. And I will say that one of my favorite moments in this show is this wall over here where you can see Krasner's and Hofmann's work together. And one of the things that I really love that emerges in the works on these walls too is that you see how important negative space is to how these artists are thinking about their compositions, whether it's in a work that seems truly abstract or one that is, very obviously based in still life. And in looking at this work of Krasner's from 1938, this is a painting on paper. You can really see how important that is. And that's a lesson that Hofmann is really imparting to people. That's something that if you're in art school in the US now, you are still learning about negative space, but that was a kind of brand new way of thinking about it and grounding formal principles in the mid 1930s. And for Krasner, she's really letting the paper breathe in this work, letting her brushstrokes sort of move in and out of the paper so that really gives the work a sense of breath, a sense of levity, and really functions with the shapes within it to show how this composition is coming together. And this work you can see is titled Still Life too, but it's really, really quite abstract. I don't think you'd probably guess that while looking at it. And one of the important takeaways here, which we also see play out on the walls and around us, is that, even as Hofmann is imparting these lessons to Krasner, she's actually the one who's making more revolutionary art at this time. She's the one who's working more abstractly, who's really taking these principles and pushing them further. And Hofmann really respected Krasner. Sometimes it came across in a way that doesn't sound so great. He said to her in class one day, looking at a drawing, he said, "This is so good, you would not know it was done by a woman." Come on. Meant as a compliment, not the best delivery. But he also really would stick up for her position and her role within not just her own art, but really American abstraction more broadly, and how important she was to Pollock. So at some point in time, somebody's talking to Hoffman about how Pollock's his student and yada, yada, yada. And he corrected them and he said, Pollock was not my student. He was the student of my student, Lee Krasner. So really putting that credit back to where it's due. The other really important thing about these schools is they start to provide artists with social networks. I mean, just think about, who, even for you, are the people that you've known the longest, had the longest friendships with, where you've also probably spent the most time with those people. They're people that you went to college with, maybe you went to high school with, that this is, really this community that's also, not just there because you have to go to school, they're choosing to go to this school. And so there really starts to be this ferment within these places like the Art Students League, like Hoffman's classes, like Gorky's classes at the Grand Central School of Art. And then in addition to that, during the 30s, we also, of course, have the New Deal programs, and the WPA of the Federal Art Project also becomes a place where artists are really coming together, exchanging ideas, developing their social networks, but really, really critical too. And I will say, Krasner was part of this WPA program as well. That really gives American artists who, as we talked about, have kind of kicked down by the artistic establishment, been demeaned, and the WPA really, this is their government recognizing them as making an important professional contribution to their country, that this is critical work that has to be done and that they are going to support it. So it's a real shot of esteem. And for women artists in particular, they're getting paid the same amount as the men. So for them, it's this kind of double source of validation of their work. So with all of this then, we're getting a lot of artists making abstraction, but how is that abstraction getting out into the world, getting out beyond the studios of the critique session at art school? And those exhibition opportunities really by the mid-1930s are pretty non-existent. The aforementioned spaces we've talked about, they really didn't show work by American artists. And, the Whitney opened in this time too, opened to the public in 1931. And though it was dedicated to American art, unlike MoMA, unlike the Gallery of Living Art, for instance, they really were pretty committed to realism. So that still left out this other group of people that were interested in this evening. And so with that dearth of exhibition opportunities, the artists come together to form a group that they called the American Abstract Artists in 1936. So they joined together regardless of exactly how they were approaching abstraction. It really was a pretty broad definition of it. And even in their kind of initial statements about what they were about, they joined together regardless of style with a, quote, liberal interpretation upon the word abstract. And from the start, notably, to a number of women artists, so about a quarter of the founding membership were women. And within this context, they were treated as equals. They were officers in the organization. They participated on committees. They wrote for publications and organized programs. And so that means that women are really at the forefront of how this abstraction is getting publicly theorized as well. And they also, they're therefore working to just facilitate discussion about abstraction, to create a public awareness of it, and of course, to exhibit their work. And a few months after forming, they staged their first show, which we see an installation view of here, and what we would now call a pop-up gallery, called the Squibb Galleries in April 1937. And in conjunction with the show, they released a portfolio of prints, and the lithographs from the women founders you can see installed here in that show that I did at the Whitney that Devin mentioned, Labyrinth of Forms, Women in Abstraction, 1930 to 1950. So these 7 works, starting at the top left and going down each column, are by Esther Slobodkina, Agnes Lyle, Marie Kennedy, Rosalind Bengelsdorf, Gertrude Green, Alice Trumbull Nason, and Ray Kaiser. And I think within this cluster, you really see the openness that the group had to a variety of approaches, which is really characteristic of American abstraction at this period, as it had yet to really solidify around a single approach. And just to highlight that point, I wanted to show 2 paintings, one by Kaiser on the right. Really kind of see this as an abstraction that's grounded in observed reality. And then this other one by Alice Trumbull Mason, which if you come to Colby is now on our walls. You can see it in person, but, much more non-representational approach, really grounded in geometry here. And so I think probably predictably from what I was saying before, the reviewers hated this show at the American Abstract Artists. They thought it was boring. They thought it was decorative. They thought it was derivative, and they thought it was disconnected from reality. Some of them, all of those at once. And the American Abstract Artists nevertheless considered the show a success. 1,500 people attended the exhibition over this 2-week period, and they sold about 500 editions of the print portfolio. And that this success really led new members to be interested in them, artists who hadn't been involved from the outset. Krasner was one of those, joining in 1940, and another was Irene Rice Pereira, coming back to her from the beginning. And Pereira had studied with Matulka at the Art Students League, and she was actually one of the rare exceptions that was pretty prominent beginning in the early 30s. She'd had some good gallery shows, and also had a really prominent position, a little bit of a different one, on the WPA. In 1935, she started working in the design lab, which was a kind of aspect of it sort of modeled on the Bauhaus that was, and really, taking art and bringing it in together with new technologies like plastic and different sorts of glass and, kind of new polymers and, all sorts of bits and bobs. And that was kind of the perfect place for her. She was really, really interested in science writ large, and particularly in light and time and space and physics and perception. And she actually considered, quote, space-time to be her medium. And we can see in comparing these two works, which are made 7 years apart, how she's really thinking through the idea of planes and space and perception, and how that idea is advancing in part through the exposure to materials in the design lab. So working on oil on canvas on the right, but inserting all these different kinds of textures, layering rectangles on top of each other so they seem to go in and out of one another, versus in transversion on the right, ceramic fluid, porcelain cement, oil paint, 2 panes of corrugated glass on hardboard and wood. Just a totally, totally different way of approaching the object while still being engaged in the idea of 2D perception. Charmian van Wiegand was another well-regarded figure who joined the group in the early years, but after its initial founding. And in the early 1940s, she began to make abstractions such as this one, which were based on automatic drawings. So yet another approach to abstraction that we are now seeing. And in addition to being an artist, van Wiegand was also an important art critic who, before joining the AAA, crucially reviewed that inaugural show, giving it its one positive review, the only one. And she really, it was not only positive, it also was a real engagement with what the material was, an attempt to understand American abstraction on its own terms and make her readers understand it as well. And her writing, combined with really the persistence of the American abstract artists, through their shows, through their catalogs, led to really a growing acceptance of abstraction in the early 1940s, with critics, even if they didn't like it, beginning to acknowledge its importance and its viability. So Edward Alden Jewell, who was the leading critic for the New York Times, actually wrote in his review, and then the AAA started to have annual exhibitions. And in the 1941 show, he finally admitted, abstraction is not just a flash in the pan, and that it appears to have come to stay. So with that, in the 1940s, we get even more spaces opening for showing this kind of art. We get the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, a bunch of different galleries, including Betty Parsons, which might sound familiar, Peggy Guggenheim's Art of This Century, certain venues that are dedicated really just to prints. Art of this Century notably has a couple of shows in 1943 and 1945 that are devoted just to the art of women. And you would think that within this context, this real blossoming, or, it's all relative, right? That the AAA would feel, on top of the world. And it's ironic, though, its influence actually begins to wane at this moment. With World War II, you begin to get an influx of European artists, and, especially the surrealists, which sort of changes things a little bit. And within that context, the American abstract artists also began to take a more dogmatic approach, have certain people who are a little more prescriptive really come into the leadership there. But the larger community of artists was really still very devoted to an experimental approach in abstraction. They wanted to pursue an array of styles and techniques in the 1940s. And one of the places that we really see a lot of activity with these ideas in mind is at the print shop Atelier 17. So this is a groundbreaking print shop that was founded in Paris and then moved to New York in 1940 through 1955 with the war. It was founded by an artist named Stanley William Hayter. And it really became a laboratory for formal and technical experimentation. So really introduces modern ideas to American printmaking, and with that really kind of, I think, arrives at what the idea of what a modern print could be. They specialized in intaglio techniques of printing, so a type of printmaking where you're incising into your matrix, so usually, not always, a copper plate. There are a bunch of different techniques within intaglio. So that's kind of the umbrella term, but if you're talking about etching, that's intaglio. If you're talking about dry point, that's intaglio. And talking about engraving, that's intaglio. Soft ground is a type of etching that gives you a lot of flexibility, and they really broadened the applications of that. They also did a lot of work on how to get color into prints, and also explored the sculptural applications of embossing, which is also an intaglio technique. So at the workshop, the artist Sue Fuller, she described it as a cell of revolution. So that's really getting at this idea, like Krasner has with the bomb going off, that there's something happening here, and it is transformative. And these well-established European figures who have come to the US during the war are working there just alongside emerging American artists. They're collaborating, they're sharing ideas, and those are really guiding principles of this place. And women make up about 40% of the artists who are working there. And as they were in the AAA, they're really recognized as important contributors and earn the respect of their peers. And this egalitarian attitude really allows them to develop their work, participate in aesthetic debates, exhibit, and establish their professional reputations in ways that were not really possible elsewhere in the art world at this time. But you can see how that's kind of building on some of the ideas that are in not just the AAA, but also that developed under the WPA as well. And so Fuller, like many artists who started their careers in the 1930s, started out working in a representational style, which we can see on the right here. And she would later understand that as a symptom of her being stuck in the, quote, hangover of the American scene. So she came to Atelier 17 in 1943, which radically changed her approach to art making. She completely abandoned realism in favor of abstraction, and these works are made just 2 years apart. If you can imagine someone taking that much of a leap in that year of 1943 of going there, so we can see just how quickly the print shop had a profound impact on her style and her subject matter. And she also really became a vital force at the studio. She actually took on the role of master printer, which was a position that had been historically reserved for men in those spaces. And as I mentioned before, one of the great achievements of Atelier 17 was this technical innovation in intaglio, and Fuller was really at the head of those initiatives. So she's single-handedly responsible for the revival of a technique called sugar lift etching, which allows artists to make really broad or even painterly passages on their plates by applying a sugar solution as a base onto the plate. She figured out how to resurrect this approach through a combination of art historical research and then just experimenting in her kitchen with Caro corn syrup. And it became widely used at the studio. It's still used for that now. And in all of the prints that she made, she's really combining her own ingenuity with other material discoveries that are made at Atelier 17, incorporating multiple techniques into her works, as many other artists working at the print shop do. And this print, Lancelot and Guinevere, is no exception. So here she's using 3 different Atelier 17 discoveries or rediscoveries to produce her final image. And let's dive in. So one of the achievements of Atelier 17 is to figure out how to print multiple colors of ink in the same print run in the press using stencils. So Fuller's using this technique to really precisely lay out exactly where these red passages would go. And you see in the detail here, just this like precise edging of the red in the edge next to the black there on the right in that arc in particular. I think that really shows that technique off. And the print shop, also I mentioned before, was really experimenting with this idea of the sculptural applications of embossing. And so to achieve this desired 3D effect, Fuller would carve her plate so deeply that ink wouldn't stay in the recessed area. So you get this sprinkle of bright white raised passages, which there's this kind of like little bean shape in the middle on the left. And that comes from that, of really like pushing the plate to its limits so that it's doing something that's exactly what you're not supposed to be doing when you're making this type of artwork. And I think most notably, as mentioned before, Fuller really seized on this idea of soft ground etching. It's really revived and expanded there. And this is a technique that uses a soft, sticky, malleable base, unlike some other intaglio techniques, which are much more difficult. So you can press objects into it to make a direct impression, rather than really kind of almost having to physically carve directly into a copper plate, for instance, in dry point. And Fuller just took this and ran with it. She used a variety of objects in her matrix, particularly fabrics and strings. And so you can see in here in particular that she's using lace, and that's where you're getting that kind of netted texture here. And she's manipulating that lace too before she's even putting it down. So you get different size holes and different sort of configurations in that pattern. But what she then does in that is she's using this real world object to create this really detailed network of lines that activates the entire surface of the composition. And so, you see this knotting, this stretching, this unraveling here in this detail. And then while many artists are working with fibrous materials like Fuller did, she really took this system a step further and developed a system, not just a way of making prints for creating her compositions. So she'd build these wooden frames and then stretch out her strings or her ribbons, her lace in between them. And then she would press her entire plate onto this construction. So you're almost going from, a kind of sculpture to make a print, which is a, kind of really counterintuitive or crazy way of approaching that, really pushing there as to how that can get made. And so this example lets you see what the fabric base is here, and then the print that results on it. So if you start doing mirrored images in your head, you can see the how those forms show up in the print on the right as if it were inked. And then she eventually then took this fabric apparatus and spun it out into its whole own thing beyond printmaking. So the same way that Dreyer is taking a lithograph beyond printmaking, she then begins to make full-on sculptures out of these, what she calls string compositions. So you can see that that's then something that engages her for the rest of her career, that she works on in different ways over time. Another Atelier 17 artist I want to highlight is Teresa D'Amico Forpom. She's an artist who's quite obscure. She's born in Brazil, began her artistic career in Sao Paulo, and was creating realistic sculptures. And then in 1941, she moves to New York and studies at the Art Students League. And 3 years later, in 1944, she starts to work at Atelier 17, which really transformed her creative process. She pivots to abstraction as well, and eventually becomes part of the community there, exhibits with the group. And like her Atelier 17 peers, Forpom's combining numerous intaglio techniques into a single print. In these details, we see on the right, we see these like simple engraved lines in the lower half of the image, and she's using soft ground and aqua tint, which is another less forgiving intaglio method, which uses a rosin to create this texture and this shape in the background. So really setting up what then becomes a quite becomes sort of a stage for him playing with embossing. So that's how you see these three-dimensional sculptural ridges here. So here she would hand fill deeply incised areas of her plate with a paintbrush after using a roller. So that retains ink. It means that all that she's doing to get these so deep that they won't hold ink, she's going against that again. So she can still get that relief, but then is taking it a step farther from what Fuller was doing. And then she gives her print an additional sculptural element through the use of open bite etching. So in this white curved detail, she left the copper plate unvarnished, so that's open, so that it's directly exposed to the plate when it's dipped in acid. And then the acid corrodes this area, and if it's left in long enough, the broader passages won't get inked, just their edges. So that creates this striped pattern within this raised curve. And so because of works like this one and her radical approach to materials, Stanley William Hayter actually cited Forpom as being at the forefront of achievement in 3D printing in his book on intaglio. There are also, we've been focused on New York, but I just want to take us out of it for a minute. This is something that's very New York centric, but there are artists around the country who are working in abstraction, including a number of California artists. And I think it's really important that as we're expanding the narrative of abstraction of American modernism here, that we also expand it geographically, take it outside of New York as well. So one of those artists is Elise, who's included here on the left. She worked in Los Angeles and was really among the first artists anywhere in the US to devote herself to non-objective abstraction. And she's also one of the first people to really embrace lithography as a fine art medium. It's come up a few times tonight, but it had been traditionally employed for commercial purposes. And then June Wayne, whose work you see on the right, also made lithographs. They both worked with the same printer, Linton Kistler, and Wayne starts working with him in the late 40s with work such as this, Black Ball in a Room. And she like Pereira, is also very interested in light and perception, and she's making works like this with the experience of going through the freeway tunnels in Los Angeles, if anybody can recall that, and how the light would move there. And Wayne, notably, after her time with Kistler, becomes really one of the leaders in the print renaissance in the 1960s in the United States. And she's the founder of the Tamarind Workshop, which then becomes that's a whole other many talks. And then finally, I just want to touch on screen print as a technology. So similarly to lithography, screen print is really sort of poo-pooed by the art establishment. It's seen as something commercial, but in 1943, Bothwell decided to teach herself how to do it. She even brought it to Paris and tried to convince French artists that this was something that they should embrace. But I think, this work, Corsica, really shows that why she would want it, that you can get these, these really kind of graceful applications of layered color through that technology. And, screen print becomes, in the 1960s, with people like Warhol, to be something that is totally accepted by fine art. She's starting this, nearly 20 years before that. And as she described herself with, characteristic modesty for artists, I was on the cutting edge at one point, and I was the only woman in Northern California doing this. This fits with myself as being an innovative person. And so hopefully by now we're kind of not saying, so what, but just in case, so what? I think, what these artists did really then ends up setting the stage for abstract expressionism, making it so that by the late 1940s, when it's really coming into its heyday, that there is this network of museums and galleries and starting to be collectors who are interested in abstraction and are then ready to take something on like Jackson Pollock. So if we started off in 1929 with Alice Trimble Mason being one of the only artists working in a non-objective way in the US, 20 years later, we have Jackson Pollock in Life magazine with the headline, "Is he the greatest living painter in the United States?" So it really becomes a a quite rapid thing. Of course, what we see here is also then this idea of abstraction becoming something that's a little more codified. And yes, there are absolutely differences between what Pollock is doing and what Mark Rothko is doing and what Willem de Kooning is doing. But there is this kind of like idea of a movement that becomes a sort of branded thing, and that is led by these, heroic male artists in their very cool poses. And so that then means that with that writing of art history, and there is also an impulse to connect what these artists are doing to the well-known European artists who, and that connection's real. It's just not the only thing. And so it's really not until the 1970s that you begin to get some digging out of this, this work of the 30s and 40s and the work of the women in particular. But that is a project that is, now 50 years later, still ongoing and continues with exhibitions such as this one, which I'm so glad is here. Thank you. Thanks. I was going to pass this around, but it's on a cord. Yeah. But yeah, I'm happy to take questions and also just have this be conversational too.
Have you read that book about Krasner's work, or the women of the women of Sixth Avenue?
Oh, Ninth Street Women. Yes.
Did you recommend that?
Yeah. It's a tomb. It's a project. Oh, if I'd read the book Ninth Street Women, which, yes, I did. It was very helpful in particular, I think, for understanding what the social structures were and the personal relationships between these artists, how the women artists knew each other, but also how they navigated their relationships with men, many of whom were their romantic partners. And I mean, it's a lovely read, but it's also over 600 pages. So it's a commitment. I saw a hand in the back. Yeah.
I was just wondering, what do you think the reaction was of all these women you spent 40 minutes talking about, and then this comes out with Jackson Pollock?
I mean, I think, they will talk about that exact kind of thing in their interviews. So when in the mid 70s, as people are, realizing like, oh, wow, there's all these great artists that we should probably talk to before they die. Krasner among them, they are actively grappling with that. They know the Jackson Pollock of it all from personal experience. Their attitudes toward it vary really widely, but I think to not include that is also, it's the elephant in the room, right? But they, Pereira, for instance, was terribly embittered by how little she felt she was acknowledged for her role in American abstraction. She was very convinced that MoMA was conspiring against her, for instance, and really bitter and angry. Others were really happy that abstraction had been acknowledged at all. They had that experience of truly no one caring, and so that it got to go forward a little bit was better. So it changed. Some of them kept up with their career in art. Others did not. Rosalind Bengelsdorf, who was one of the founders of the AAA, included in that print portfolio, for instance, married artist Byron Brown, and kind of decided once she was married, there's not room in this relationship for two artists. I'm going to go be an art critic. But then she, in turn, then is writing about and interviewing some of these women. So I think it's not. They all knew it. They all felt it. And we unfortunately haven't gotten to a place where we kind of can't talk about Pollock when this happens, because I think as much as that gives abstraction, an American abstraction, and international position, it is also part of the reason that we don't know these artists more. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, does this article mention Lee Krasner?
I don't think so.
So he did it just all on his own?
Yeah, and I mean,
You see how
yeah, and you know, Krasner also talked about herself as, you know, having to take on the role of being Mrs. Jackson Pollock, which was something that she was doing while he was alive, but something that she also felt a major impetus to do after he died, not too long after this, that, you know, she rightly felt that he deserved to be recognized. And without her, I mean, he really, you know, not only was, she Hoffman's student who taught him, and she really paved the way for him to come into the art world. She was the one who was connected to the WPA and knew everybody in the AAA and, you know, was hanging out with Gorky, et cetera. And Pollock's just like some guy and some drunk guy. And so, you know, she did that for him at the beginning of his career, and he, you know, very easily could have faded from memory were it not for her efforts after his passing. You know, really serious gumption and crossing your fingers too of you know, what she did for his pricing, for instance. So, but yeah, they would have talked about who her husband was, but, you know, to acknowledge the personal life of the men wouldn't have been something that would have happened. Often still isn't.
Could you talk about you know, one of the interesting things that you started your talk about was around institutions and specifically schools, because I feel like we often think about institutions as often barring women, but there's a unique moment here that kind of carries on where academia is kind of a way in which women are finding a platform in at least initial community. You know, one could even think about Algonquin at the turn of the century and all of, you know, the women who were coming up from Boston for summer school and education there that formed communities, and then that kind of legacy out of the late 19th century, kind of slightly more bohemian, if we could call it that, at least maybe for the time, in retrospect, probably not, but space for women to find space. You know, obviously there's inherent sexism, that, you know, there is not gender parity, but it is a space. Could you kind of talk about some of these spaces just a little more, so like why the 1930s, obviously WPA, but it's kind of complemented that sort of area?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, Vitlichil, Hoffman, Matulka, Gorky, these people coming into the schools is tremendously important. You know, they're not teaching all of the classes though. So at the same time that they're there doing that, you know, Lee Krasner is taking classes with George Bridgman, you know, figurative artist, very traditional, not really known anymore. And so within these classes in particular, you really have like-minded people finding each other. And I think especially around Matulka, there's you know, there's a sense that like these are people that are opening up worlds that are really facilitating things that people, you know, would really kind of follow them, and that these teachers are also there is crossover between also what is happening in these educational institutions and what's happening at MoMA, for instance. And so the teachers are encouraging these artists to go see together. And so like Rosalind Bengelsdorf, to go back to her, is going to MoMA with Gorky. And that as a type of education is just as important. And so I think, and then I think what happens in these schools is that you develop, and you know, that is true of art colonies in Maine or many other places that artists congregate. You really have this system of mutual support. And so that then you have this, you know, social and artistic professional network that is, you know, combining with an educational apparatus or facilitated by it, combining with museums, combining with just greater exposure to that art, that really like sets up this stage for the blossoming. I don't know if that is enough.
I think the idea of these are spaces that, like you said, are self-selected and self-chosen.
Yeah.
And the second you leave those spaces and enter the market,
Right, and I think, I think like the other, I didn't say it quite this way, but I think actually the fact that there was no market is also really important, because without market, there's not really competition in the same way. So some of them actually in their interviews and so forth do talk about upon reflection, when they're also and really related to this point of also asking about Pollock or de Kooning, what have you, they're kind of reflecting positively, like, there's a great quote by June Wayne, where she talks about, I can probably find it very quickly, actually. She talks about it being, here she goes. She says, undistracted by the possibility of success, all attention was on the work and boldness knew no limits. To show my newest painting to another artist was like showing a griffin I had caught while hunting. There were no critics weighing it, no curators measuring and stuffing it. There were no other griffins to compare it to. Isolation made the griffin possible. So there's that freedom and like, okay, what's abstraction? What are we all doing here? But then also when you don't feel like you have the world watching and judging, and the community is that one that you're finding. And I think that's a bunch of them talk about that as being really, really key too. And one that really fosters these communities being supportive rather than competitive, which especially for postgraduate education is not always a given.
well, I think at that point, it might be a perfect place to stop for tonight. So everyone, a round of applause.
Thanks.